Today we're going to create a Flask application that's using MongoDB via the PyMongo Python API. And we're going to wrap all of that up into Docker containers and use a tool called Docker Compose to build the complete application, including running Flask app in a container, the Mongo database in a container, linked those together so they can communicate all in one command, Docker Compose up. So we're going to start from scratch here because this is really very simple and create it from nothing so that you guys know what to do. A few things before we start. I am running on a Mac, so I do have the boot to Docker tool running version 1.6.0. Boot to Docker is needed if you're on a Mac because Docker only runs on Linux. So boot to Docker creates a really lightweight Linux virtual machine that then all of your Docker containers run on. If you're on Windows, I assume there's probably something similar to this, but I cannot confirm that. But you could always just run on a virtual machine. And if you're on Linux, you don't need this. I also have Docker 1.6.0 and Docker Compose. Also probably, Docker Compose 1.2.0. So those are the versions I've got. That's what we're starting with. And let's get going. So what we're going to do is build a very stripped down minimal to-do application. At the end, basically what it's going to be able to do is add new items and display them. We're not going to worry about deleting them or making them done or whatever, and it's not going to be pretty. We just want to build a basic Flask application that's communicating with MongoDB and put it into Docker. So we're going to need a few files here. We'll need the app. We're going to need this config. I'll talk more about that later, of course. Talk about all this. We're going to need some templates, or really templates. We're going to need a Docker file, and we're going to need a Docker Compose YAML file. And then we'll also need a requirements.txt file. So that's basically everything that we're going to need for this thing to run. This is going to give us a Flask application, building that into a Docker container, a completely running MongoDB, and a Docker container, and both of those linked together running and communicating, all in this set of files here. So let's go ahead and just get started by creating the Flask application first. So let's start with just a very simple Flask application. And just make sure we can get that running first. Okay. So this should look very familiar. This is our absolute bare minimum Flask application. We could just run this very simply with a Python app.py, and we would see hello returned in the browser. So this is basically what we're going to start with, and then we're going to have one more route. So let's go ahead and add that, and that's going to be the new routes. On this route, we are actually going to only accept post requests because we're adding something. So new. And then let's actually just redirect this to do. So when we finish up inserting something, we just want to go back to the main page, and then we'll be good. What doesn't it like? Oh, okay. So we used a couple more things we need to import here: redirects and URL for. So those are all Flask things. So when we hit this new, after it does whatever it's going to do, we're just going to redirect back to this main thing. So that's where we're starting. Let's go ahead and move on. So the next thing we need to do is let's just populate this requirement.txt file. That's it. We're going to do Flask and PyMongo. So pretty simple. So let's do the Docker file next. So this Docker file is going to define the running Docker image and the container for the Flask application. It doesn't define anything about the database, and it will just run in its own little isolated container. So let's start with Python. This is going to be the official Python image for 2.7. This is a Docker Hub hosted Python image, and so when we run this, we're going to start with this base layer of Python. From that, we're going to go ahead and add our source directory, our root directory, and this is that directory I showed you earlier that contains all of these files, most importantly our app and the requirements.txt. We're going to add that to our container, and let's just add it to a directory called to-do. We're going to move to to-do, and then we're going to run a command. This command is just going to be pip install requirements. So what this is basically telling Docker to do is start from the base Python image, mount our source directory to it, and then pip install the requirements.txt. So that's great. That's all we want to do here. The next thing we want to start with is this Docker compose YAML file. So this file defines some similar things. But it's basically going to tell Docker Compose what to do. And this is actually the mechanism we're going to use to define the link between the database and our application. For right now, we're going to ignore the database part because we don't need it yet. We don't have anything in our Flask application that's using a database. So this is all we need. We're going to start by creating this web container. We're going to build from the source, which this is going to run build on this Docker file below, build that image, and then it's going to run that image. Inside of that image, it's going to run app.py, Python app.py, which is going to start our Flask application. And then it's going to expose port 5000, which our application's running on, and of course it has this to-do volume, which is something we need. So one thing we do need to do to our Flask application that's different from just base to make it work with Docker is define our host. So our host in this case is just going to be 0000. That's all we need to do for this thing to run on localhost and Docker container. Only difference between a normal Flask app and what we need in Docker. With that, we have everything we need to start this guy up in Docker. So let's go over here and start up our boot to Docker virtual machine. So again, for those of you that aren't familiar with boot to Docker, all this is doing is starting up a virtual machine that is a very, very lightweight Linux distribution. And then when we run all of our other Docker commands, they're going to run inside of this virtual machine. This allows us to run Docker, which is a native Linux-only thing, from Mac. So when we run boot to Docker up, it creates this virtual machine. You can see it took almost no time, and then asks us to set these variables. So we go ahead and set those. One thing we're going to want to know is the IP of this machine. So we'll note that for later, and then you'll see when we use that in a second here. So let's go over here and we're going to cd into our to-do app. Remember, this is where we have all of these files we just created. And then let's go ahead and just run docker compose build. So my apologies. So started a new shell, so we're going to need to set these environment variables over here so we know how to connect to the container. So let's start from scratch here, and we want to run docker compose build. So it's building our container. You can see that it started from Python. It added our thing. We went to the working directory. Now we're installing Flask and PyMongo. So it's doing everything we want. So you can see successfully built. One note is that normally you would just be able to run docker compose up. Up would build and then start the container. Right now there's a bug in docker compose that doesn't allow that to happen, so we build and up in two separate commands. So we ran build, it worked, and now we're going to run docker compose up. It's going to use that built container and start it up in our virtual machine. So now you can see we're running on port 5000. This is where that IP comes into play. So let's go ahead and grab this IP here. And then if we hop over into the browser and we hit that IP on port 5000, we should see hello. So what we have going on at this point, we have our Flask app. We have these two files, the Docker file on the bottom here and the Docker compose YAML file at the top, that define how our app is being built into Docker. We have a boot to Docker container only because we're on Mac, and that's that IP that we accessed. And so when we ran docker compose up, it built that Docker image, which contains our Flask application, put it on our boot to Docker virtual machine, and then ran the command we defined in the YAML, the python app.py, and started up our Flask application in that container. So then when we go to our browser and we hit port 5000, we are accessing that Flask application inside of our Docker container. So at this point, we have a completely containerized Flask application in 3 very, very simple files. So this in itself is very powerful. But what's even more powerful is the fact that we can do this. We are going to define a link to this thing called DB. Now we need to define DB. And this database is just simply going to be the Mongo. We're going to use 3.0.2 just so we fix the version here. That's it. So at that point we have, with these 4 lines, we've defined everything that we need to create another container with a Mongo database running inside of it and link our web container, which has our Flask application running inside of it, together. 4 lines, and we linked a Flask and MongoDB running in completely isolated containers. That's pretty incredible. Of course, our Flask application is not at all utilizing that yet, but we'll go ahead and get to that right now. So what we want to make this do is start using our Mongo database that we just defined. We have not created yet. So we're going to use PyMongo to do that. A really simple API, and we're going to create a client here, which is just our Mongo client. We'll have to do a little bit more work on that line. I'll talk about that in a second. We're going to create a new DB. Let's call this to do DB. And then we're just ready to go ahead and start using that. So the first thing we're probably going to want to do is build up our mechanism for creating a new document inside of that DB. So let's just scaffold this here, and then I'll explain what this is actually going to be. Okay, so we've created this little dictionary. We're calling it a doc. Dictionary and document, kind of synonymous with MongoDB. So we're using this new thing called requests, and actually it's not request, it's request. Can't tell you how many times I've done that. And we need to, of course, import that thing here. So that's a Flask item, and so basically what we're going to have is on this page that we render, we're going to have a form that allows us to enter a name and description for an item, a to-do item, and then when it posts that item to this new route, we're going to go pull it out here, and then we're just going to really just dump it straight into the database. We're not going to do anything fancy here. We're just going to dump that document, whatever's in it, straight into the database. Probably in a production application, you might want to consider doing a little more work there. But okay, so now we have this mechanism for inserting stuff into the database. We don't have the form or the web page designed to do that yet, but we'll do that in a second. Also very easy. We'll want our application, of course, to render that list of items to do. So let's go ahead and pull those items from the database. To-do db.find. So this is just going to give us a document of all of the things that we insert in the database. We want to parse it down a little bit more so it's easy to render. So this is going to give us a list of objects that have a name and description. And then instead of just rendering hello here, we're going to render a template. Remember, we created that file. We haven't actually created the template yet, but we're just going to render it. So we're rendering the to-do template, and we're going to pass items to it. Of course, we need to include render template here as well. So that's all of the database logic that we're going to have in this application. So it's still really, really simple. The next thing we really need to do is create this to-do .html templates. And so we go into our to-do app, we go to the templates directory, we'll pop open to-do. This template is just going to be a really simple, really simple template. So let's go ahead and, my apologies. So we're going to take for items, for item in items, we're just going to render item name. So we're going to render name as a heading, and we're going to render the description as just a simple paragraph task, and let's end the for loop. So that's the extent of our template. So it's just going to render every item that we put in the database really simply to our web page. And so that's everything we need. One piece that's missing is Mongo client here. So normally if we were just running a Mongo database on localhost and our app on localhost just all together, we could just use the defaults here because it just defaults localhost port, I believe 27017. But because we're running in this linked Docker container, we need to know something about this here. So this Mongo client takes two options. It takes an IP and a port. We know the port, that's going to be 27017 because the Docker container just runs the default thing. But what we don't know is what this IP is. Luckily for us, when Docker creates containers that are linked together, it also sets a bunch of environment and variables. So we can actually pull out the IP that we need to connect to from the environment where this app is running. In this case, it's going to be to-do db1 port 27017 TCP. These are documented really well. So the DB came from this right here. So let's just go ahead and close this side here so we can see what we actually did. This environment variable is a Docker Compose created thing. You can go look at all the environment variables it sets, but basically this is giving us the IP of the database container so that we can connect to it via our Mongo client. So we have everything here that we need to create this app running in Docker with a database. So just right quick before we go run this, let's just run back through exactly what we have. We have a Flask application. We have a requirements.txt file. We have a Docker file that defines a running Docker image that's the Flask application. And we have this Docker Compose file which defines two images, the web image and the database image. The web just being built from our Docker file that we defined here, and the database being built from an existing image on Docker Hub that's Mongo. And we've linked our web image to our database image. We also have a Jinja template here that's going to render, and we've added database logic into our app. So we go back over here to Docker Compose, and you can actually see we still have the application running, and it just died because we forgot to import OS here. So now we can go ahead and rebuild our Docker containers. And so we're building our Python web container image, that's our Flask application. And then it's also going to download the image for PyMongo. And so you can see that we've successfully built both. And with this simple, remember I promised one command, Docker Compose up, we now have created a database and a Python Flask application that is communicating with it. And now if we go back to our browser and we hit this, you'll notice nothing, which is exactly what we want. So what's happened here is that we've hit our route here, and it tried to go get all these items from the database, of which there are none yet, and rendered them to the browser. Of course, they rendered nothing. So we need to add a little mechanism into our web page to insert these new items. And so to do that, let's just add a very simple form to the top of our page that will allow us to add these things. So we're just going to create a new form. Its action is going to be new, method's going to be post. We're going to have some inputs here of type text. The name of this one is just going to be name. We're going to need another one of these for our description. And then we'll also need a submit button. And we can close our form. So now we have this form. Notice because we are running the debug that we actually don't need to change, we don't need to rerun that up. We're just running and debugging. So now if we hit this, you can see we have this form here. So let's just add a to-do item, foo, do foo. So we should see foo and do foo. So what happened here? We entered this, we submitted, it posted, and we can actually go look at this. You can see it posted new with our data there. That was inserted into our Mongo database, and then it redirected to our Git page, which now is rendering these. And so you can see we just keep adding these if we want to, and just kind of keep adding them. So at this point, everything that I set out to show you, I've showed you. And with the simple amount of work that we put together here, we have a completely database-driven web application running in isolated Docker containers, and that's pretty amazing in my book, and it's why I wanted to share this. So before I leave you, I just want to reiterate how easy this is with these 3 files here. These are really the 3 files that are the core of what we're doing here. Of course, there's a template and a requirements.txt, but those are just ancillary. These 3 files, a Docker file, a Docker Compose file, and our application, we're able to completely create a isolated running Flask application that's database driven by MongoDB with Docker, and that's pretty great. So if you have questions, the Docker documentation is great. If you have any questions about the Flask app, wherever you found this, I'm sure you can find me via social media there. Twitter at PurdonKyle, GitHub kpurdon, my website's kylepurdon.com. This will be posted in all of those places. And with that, thanks.